is the first emperor's tomb. And it's at the center of what is thought to be the largest burial complex in the world.
For more than 2,000 years, the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, has remained sealed beneath a vast mound of earth. Not because it was forgotten, but because no one dared to open it. Ancient texts warned of underground palaces guarded by rivers of liquid mercury and traps built to kill intruders. No living person has ever seen what truly lies inside. Above ground, the Terracotta Army stands as the only visible clue to something far greater below. Now, modern technology exposes signs too disturbing to dismiss. What truly awaits inside the emperor's forbidden tomb? And why was it sealed for so long? Qin Shi Huang became the first ruler to turn warring kingdoms into one China, and he did it by making fear feel like law. In 221 BCE, after years of brutal campaigning, the king of Qin declared himself the first emperor and ended the warring states era. His reign is commonly dated from 221 to 210 BCE, and later accounts describe a leader seen as almost godlike by some and terrifying by others. He forced a single system across the land, standardizing writing, currency, weights, and measures so distant regions could be controlled under one rule. But the order did not come gently. Huge state projects began, including early defensive walls later tied to the Great Wall story, and they were fed by forced labor on a massive scale. Strict legalist laws shape daily life, and the tradition of burning books is linked to 213 BCE, though historians still debate the details and how the story was recorded later. The message was simple: unity would be enforced, not negotiated, and anyone who challenged it could vanish. Yet the deeper his control reached, the more anxiety grew inside him. But even absolute power could not protect him from one enemy he feared most: death. So what happens when a ruler who conquered everything starts fighting the grave instead? Qin Shi Huang ruled like a man racing a clock because the more land he controlled, the louder he felt time ticking behind him. He was the first emperor of a unified China, yet he could not unify the one thing every human faces. The court could punish rebels, armies could crush rivals, and laws could bend daily life, but none of that could stop aging. So his fear shifted from enemies he could see to an ending he could not touch, and that fear became a mission. Instead of planning for a quiet legacy, he started hunting for a way out. Ancient stories promised islands over the sea where immortals lived, and advisors spoke of rare ingredients that could keep the body from breaking down. The emperor funded journeys, sent envoys beyond familiar borders, and demanded results that sounded like miracles. One famous tale links him to the voyager Su Fu, who sailed east in search of an elixir and never returned. His court alchemists offered answers, and those answers came in cups and pellets. Early Chinese alchemy treated metals and minerals as powerful, and mercury was seen as a substance that could transform the body the way it transformed in a furnace. In the language of the palace, it was not poisonous, it was medicine, and it came with the kind of confidence that can only exist when no one dares to say no. Here's the decode moment. Mercury can harm the nervous system and organs, and long-term exposure can cause shaking, confusion, and a slow collapse that looks like the body turning against itself. That means the same immortality treatment could make a ruler more anxious, more suspicious, and more desperate, which then pushes him to take even more. It is a trap that closes with no visible chains. That is the cruel irony at the heart of this story. He wanted a potion that would freeze his life in place, but he may have been swallowing his own ending, dose after dose, convinced it was working. Imagine the pressure inside that court. If the emperor believed death was near, every failed promise could feel like betrayal, and every new formula could feel like the last chance to win. Then, in 210 BCE, during a tour far from the capital, he became seriously ill and died before he could return. The exact cause is still debated, but many accounts point to mercury mixtures as a possible reason because the obsession and the ingredients fit too well. And while he chased immortality, he prepared for the opposite. He ordered a tomb complex on a scale no one had ever attempted, a hidden kingdom meant to last longer than memory. Accounts describe an underground palace beneath Mount Li, filled with rare objects shaped like a model of his empire and defended in ways meant to make entry dangerous. Even above ground, the Terracotta Army stands like a warning. Thousands of life-sized figures, each with different faces, line up as if the emperor's command still echoes in the dirt. This is where the obsession becomes unsettling, because it reveals a mind that refuses to accept limits. If he could not live forever, then he would still rule forever, and he would do it from a world sealed under stone. So the question is not only what ended his life, but what his fear created. When a ruler treats death like an enemy state, what kind of underground empire does he leave behind for the living to discover next? Qin Shi Huang did not wait for death to begin ruling beneath the earth, because the moment he took the throne, the ground itself became part of his plan. Historical records state that construction of his tomb began when he was only 13 years old, long before China was fully unified. From the start, this was not imagined as a simple burial site. It was designed as a vast underground world, one that would mirror the empire he was still fighting to control above ground. As years passed and his power expanded, the project grew with it, both in scale and in ambition. The work continued for nearly 4 decades, spanning most of the emperor's life. Ancient sources describe a labor force that reached into the hundreds of thousands. These were not skilled volunteers. They were prisoners, enslaved workers, and peasants taken from their villages and forced into service. They dug deep into the earth, hauled stone, carved chambers, and shaped corridors that would never see sunlight again. Many of these workers never returned home. Some died from exhaustion, hunger, or injury, crushed by the same stones they were ordered to move. Others vanished into the project itself, swallowed by a system that valued secrecy over life. The tomb did not rise through inspiration. It was carved through suffering, one body at a time. Ancient historians later wrote that when major sections were finished, the emperor ordered parts of the workforce killed to prevent the secrets from spreading. According to these accounts, some laborers were buried alive within the structure they helped create. Whether every detail is true remains debated, but the story persisted for centuries because it matched what people already knew about his rule. Fear was never a side effect, it was a tool. This is the decode moment. The tomb was not meant to honor death. It was meant to deny it. Every corridor, chamber, and sealed passage was built as if the emperor would continue to command, judge, and defend his power forever. This underground world was not separate from the empire above. It was its shadow. The location itself reinforces that idea. The tomb complex near Mount Li stretches across a massive area, with the central burial mound only one part of a much larger design. Surrounding pits, hidden structures, and guarded zones suggest planning on a scale normally reserved for living capitals, not graves. The emperor was not preparing for rest, he was preparing for rule without an end. Even the timeline tells a disturbing story. While wars raged, cities burned, and laws tightened, resources continued flowing underground. Stone, metal, labor, and time were diverted into a project no one alive would benefit from. That choice reveals priority. The afterlife mattered more than the present because it was the only place his authority could never be challenged. As the years passed, the tomb became more complex, more sealed, and more dangerous. Layers were added not just to protect what was inside, but to erase the path back out. Knowledge of the layout became rare, then forbidden, then fatal. By the time Qin Shi Huang died, the underground empire was already complete enough to function without him. That is what makes this chapter unsettling. The tomb was not a reaction to death. It was a parallel state built in advance, waiting patiently beneath the soil. Above ground, people lived under his laws. Below ground, his power was preserved in stone. So when we picture this construction, the real question is not how it was built, but why it was built this way. What kind of ruler invests decades of human lives to create a kingdom meant only for the dead? For centuries, the story of Qin Shi Huang's tomb sounded like a warning written to scare thieves away, yet the details kept returning because they were strangely specific. The historian Sima Qian, writing in the 1st century BCE, described an underground palace built to mimic the emperor's world. He wrote of treasures packed into halls and of mercury used to model great rivers and seas so they seemed to flow. Above that hidden landscape, the ceiling was said to glitter with painted stars, turning the tomb into a sealed cosmos with the emperor at its center. Sima Qian also described a project so huge it felt unreal, with hundreds of thousands of workers shaping chambers beneath Mount Liai. Modern surveys agree on one thing: this was never a single room. Ground studies indicate large hollow spaces under the mound, and archaeologists have reported drainage and an underground dam system that may have helped keep groundwater out over time. On the surface, the Terracotta Army makes those claims feel less like myth. Archaeologists estimate more than 8,000 soldiers in the main pits, along with 130 chariots and 520 horses, and many figures remain buried where they were placed. Each face looks individual, as if a real army was frozen mid-march, ready to defend a ruler who never wanted to be helpless. Rumor then adds the darker layer. Retellings speak of traps, especially crossbows set to fire automatically, aimed at anyone who forced their way through the chambers. Whether or not every mechanism existed is unknown, but the idea matches the logic of a paranoid ruler. If he feared enemies in life, the dead would need guards too. Here is the decode moment. Legends survive when they offer a map, not just a mood. Sima Qian's account points to materials and engineering choices that can be checked, like mercury, water control, and chamber layout, even if the central vault remains unopened. In other words, the story is not only scary, it is testable. It turns fear into real measurable clues. That is why modern science listened. Surveys around the burial mound found unusually high mercury signals, and researchers have treated this as evidence that the ancient description may reflect a real design element, not pure symbolism. A detailed mercury survey published decades ago reported a strong anomaly in soil samples over the mound, and a 2020 study notes that Sima Qian described liquid mercury inside the chamber, linking it to both map-making and beliefs about life extension. Some readings are disputed, but the pattern keeps pointing back to the same buried idea. Even that does not prove the full legend. A river of mercury, a starry ceiling, and rooms filled with gold could still be partly metaphor or partly exaggeration, because Sima Qian wrote after the emperor's death and relied on earlier sources. Yet the Terracotta Army already proved that the builders could create enormous, detailed underground spaces without leaving them open to view, so the tomb became a paradox. It is one of history's most famous places, yet its heart remains unseen, protected by caution as much as by stone. The more the outside clues align with the old text, the harder it is to dismiss the rest, and the harder it is to justify breaking the seal. For centuries, people called these accounts impossible. Now, instruments in the ground are finding echoes that sound uncomfortably close. If the legends were partly true, what other defenses and what other secrets are waiting in the darkness, and what would it cost to learn them? The legends around Qin Shi Huang's tomb stopped sounding like folklore the moment scientists began to measure what the human eye could not see. In the 1970s, teams collected soil samples around the burial mound, and the results pointed to mercury at levels far above the local background. That mattered because mercury is not just a poetic symbol, it is a toxic metal that can leak as vapor, so an abnormal signal around a sealed tomb suggests something inside is still present and still active. Decades later, researchers used laser sensing to scan the air above the mound from multiple positions, and they again found elevated mercury in the atmosphere. Even more unsettling, the stronger patches matched earlier ground readings, like two instruments hearing the same whisper from below. Decode this clue for a moment. Mercury is heavy, expensive, and dangerous to move in bulk, so it is unlikely to be placed underground for decoration alone. If it was carried into the chamber and arranged like rivers, the goal was probably control, because a sealed space filled with mercury vapor can punish anyone who enters without protection. In that sense, mercury was not a treasure, it was a weapon, and the warning sign is already leaking into the world above. Once the mercury story shifted from myth to measurable data, technology moved closer, but it did not rush in. Archaeologists focused on non-invasive tools that can map hidden spaces without opening the central chamber, and ground-penetrating radar became one of the most talked about methods. It sends pulses into the soil and reads the echoes, which helps outline where solid earth ends and hollow voids begin. Some teams even map mercury vapor patterns as if they trace waterways, which echoes the ancient idea of an underground landscape built to imitate the empire itself. Remote sensing and geophysical surveys support the same core idea. The mound sits above a large planned complex, not a single pit with one coffin. That scale changes everything, because a bigger underground space means a bigger system of corridors, courtyards, and sealed rooms, and systems are designed with strategy, not just grief. There is also evidence that the builders understood water and decay. Reports describe an underground dam and drainage system near the site, a practical solution that could keep groundwater from flooding key areas. That detail matters because it shows the tomb was engineered to survive for centuries, which makes the mercury signal feel less accidental and more deliberate. Modern documentation added another layer. LiDAR, drone surveys, and 3D recording are now used to capture the surface landscape and connect it to subsurface models. Popular retellings sometimes claim that the interior layout mirrors constellations, echoing old accounts of a star-filled ceiling. What is safer to say is that the builders planned with symmetry and hierarchy, and the new models increasingly suggest an ordered world below. Decode that too. An ordered plan is a message, because it tells you the tomb was meant to be read like a map of power, with a center that dominates everything around it. So the myths did not disappear, they narrowed into sharper questions. If mercury readings suggest danger and radar suggests vast chambers, then the unopened center is not just hiding art. It may be preserving a sealed environment that modern excavation cannot easily control, where air, chemistry, and fragile materials could fail the moment the barrier breaks. If science confirmed the myths from the outside, what exactly is waiting in the room no one has dared to enter? This This was never going to be a normal dig because Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum is treated like a sealed system that could harm both people and history. The central burial chamber under the mound is still unexcavated, and that choice is not only about respect. Soil studies and later scientific surveys have reported unusually high mercury around the mound, and conservators warn that opening a space sealed for more than 2,000 years could destroy wood, silk, and paint as soon as air and humidity change. That is why the safest entrance today is data, not a shovel. Decode that for a moment. Mercury is not a spooky detail from an ancient book. It is a real chemical threat that can evaporate, enter the lungs, and damage the body. If the chamber contains pooled mercury, as the historian Sima Qian described, then the tomb is not only a treasure vault, it is also a quietly toxic source that demands strict containment. The emperor's defense was not just stone and soldiers, it was chemistry, turning the air itself into a weapon. Even without breaching the core, the outer pits show what this fortress means in practice. The Terracotta Army includes thousands of life-sized figures arranged like a real force, and the scale signals planning on an industrial level. Archaeology in the wider complex has also uncovered bronze chariots, workshops that supplied the burial city, and pits where real horses were buried. Step back and it stops feeling like a grave. It starts feeling like a capital built for the dead, complete with guards, roads, and supply pits. Then comes the detail that sounds like science fiction, but sits in museum trays under bright lab lights. Many bronze weapons from the Terracotta Army pits have survived with sharp edges and surprisingly clean surfaces after more than 2,000 years underground. Researchers argue that this preservation is best explained by soil conditions and the way the weapons were stored, not by a magical chrome coating myth. The point is simple and unsettling. The underground world was built to stay ready, even without a living hand. Legends speak of automatic crossbows aimed at intruders and corridors built like a maze with false rooms. No one can test it yet because the main chamber stays sealed today. The darker layer is the human cost. Ancient accounts claim that workers and witnesses were killed to keep the inner secrets from spreading, and the stories persist because the site includes burials and human remains across the larger necropolis. Archaeology cannot confirm every detail in the old texts, but the pattern fits the Qin state's harsh use of forced labor and punishment. In this place, silence was part of the architecture, so if anyone ever tried to go deeper, the plan would look less like archaeology and more like a hazardous entry. Engineers would use controlled tents, filters, protective suits, and robotic cameras that go first, because a human step is the fastest way to contaminate or collapse a sealed space. Radar, 3D mapping, and microsampling can outline chambers and corridors without breaking a single brick, because one careless breach could wipe out what survived only because nobody touched it. And that is the twist. People call it a tomb, but everything about it behaves like a warning system designed to outlast thieves, time, and curiosity. If the outer pits already show weapons that stayed sharp and sacrifices that stayed silent, then what does the sealed heart still protect, and what price would it demand from anyone who tries to look inside? Archaeologists stand at a painful crossroads because Qin Shi Huang's tomb is not just a site, it is a sealed experiment in time. One side argues for patience. They remind us that once air enters a chamber, silk can crumble, wood can warp, and pigments can fade in hours, turning a once-in-a-lifetime discovery into dust. They also point to the mercury evidence around the mound, because toxic vapor is not a legend, it is a real risk to researchers and nearby land. The other side argues that history is already slipping away. They believe careful technology can map, sample, and maybe one day enter without destroying what survived for 2,000 years, and they say the Terracotta Army proved that hidden chambers can change what we think we know. Yet the deeper truth is simpler. This tomb reflects a ruler who could not release control. He built laws to unify the living, and he built an underground kingdom to command the dead, so even now the world still negotiates with his fear. Qin Shi Huang's legacy does not end in textbooks. It sits beneath the earth, waiting behind stone, chemistry, and silence. Every new scan sharpens the outline, but it also sharpens the moral weight, because today's best tools still cannot promise full preservation or safety for everyone involved. So here's the question that refuses to die. If opening the tomb could endanger both history and the living, should it ever have been opened at all?